Thanks for joining us this evening. We have finally made it to our first unit that didn't start before the year 1000. So we are, with the exception of some context tonight, fully through the first 1,000 church history. So give yourself a pat on the back, I suppose, for making it this far. Tonight we have come to the Crusades. And whenever we hear the word Crusades, I'm sure most of us have a roughly similar vision or image in our heads of what it looks like, that being masses of Christians marching toward the Holy Land, and inevitably endless conflict and bloodshed between Christians and Muslims. But like basically everything else in life and in history, it's also vastly more complicated than that kind of oversimplification. When we popularly think of the Crusades taking place in the Holy Land against the Muslims, for example, we leave out the fact, or in some cases we were never taught the fact, that Europeans, as Europeans were on that quest in the East, there were crusades happening in Europe at the same time. In fact, there's roughly 4 dozen military movements or expeditions or campaigns by the church from 1095 to about 1492 that are considered by historians to be worth calling crusades. And less than half of them actually involve Muslims. Over half of those movements that can be called crusades were fought in Europe between various groups that identified as Christians, actually. But why don't we hear about those? And so as we dig into the breadth of the Crusades tonight, we'll ask 3 particular questions as we go along. First being, why did the Crusades happen? What made tens of thousands of people leave their homes and their lives in Europe and embark on a journey towards the home of our Lord, especially when they knew the risks involved? Second, were the Crusades successful? Or were they unsuccessful? And lastly, what effect did the Crusades have on both the history of the world and on the history of the church? I can tell you right off the bat, as we examine the causes and the motivations behind the Crusades, that this question, on the whole, is not going to have a complete answer. And that's because not only is there no single reason behind the Crusades coming into being, but also because basically no one agrees on all of the reasons why the Crusades happened. There's many different ideas and theories advanced, but none of them seem to be satisfactory. But let's, first start with a bit of context, as I said, leading up to them. As we've seen throughout our time, ever since Christianity was first officially adopted by the Roman Empire as the state religion of Rome, the church began growing in power. Even after the Western Roman Empire fell, the church still grew in power. And the ways in which people did church between Western and Eastern Europe came to be more and more different. But what became uniformly true was that the Western Church under the Pope and the Eastern Church under the patriarchs each continued to grow more intertwined with the affairs of the state. So kingdoms rise and fall during this time, rulers come and go. But the one true rock in the West and the East that people always had to lean on was the church. And this was not an accident. As the church grows in power and significance, it became an increasingly popular idea at basically all levels of society to try to usher in what they thought was a Christian society. A societal structure where learning, economics, the arts, architecture, music, language, and daily moral behavior all fell under the auspices of what people believed to be that which was dictated by God. This is why, if you look back during this time, so much writing and art and music and so many stories and poems and so many other things from the Western world throughout the Middle Ages have something to do with God or Christ or the Bible. It's why Renaissance painters like Da Vinci are still painting the Last Supper, or Michelangelo is painting on the Sistine Chapel, things in that train of thought for perspective, all the way later in the Renaissance. But just because people said and believed that they wanted a Christian society did not mean people stopped fighting and killing each other in Europe. The states of Europe continually fought one another for military, political, economic, or even purportedly Christian reasons. And even as the church grew in power in the West, so too alongside it grew the power of political Europe as well. We see in this time states like England, France, and the Holy Roman Empire rise to the top of the Western pecking order. And one of the hallmarks, both of the ties between the church and the state, and of the role of political authorities in the life of the church, is the concept of investiture. Put simply, investiture was the practice of political rulers appointing bishops within the church for the church. For centuries, actually, this was how all bishops were appointed all across Europe and in the East. This was how the popes and the patriarchs all were approved up till the time of the investiture controversy. The Holy Roman Emperors themselves believed that only they had the right not only to appoint bishops within the church, but to appoint the Pope himself. Unfortunately, as you can expect, this came with many foreseeable problems. First, there were many in the church, east and west, that didn't exactly care for the idea of outside authorities performing a function of the church for the church, a function that should lay within the hands of the church itself. But just as importantly, which often came part and parcel with this political handling of investiture, was what was called simony. Simony is named after, if you remember, Simon the sorcerer, who Luke tells us in Acts tried to get two disciples of Jesus to give him the power to impart the Holy Spirit on anyone he laid hands on, and he would pay them a large sum in exchange. Simony is the sale of church offices or property. And simony became a common practice wherein wealthy families and nobility that often owned the lands that churches were built on would sell positions within the church, oftentimes actually to children of nobles who were not the firstborn and did not get all of their family's wealth, if you remember the concept of primogeniture. But this investiture problem continues to bubble up, and it hits critical mass in 1075. In 1075, Pope Gregory VII, as part of his Gregorian reforms to the church that largely centered around the moral integrity of the clergy, he inserts a clause stating that the deposal or the removal of a ruler was under the sole power of the Pope. In other words, only the Pope could say when a ruler wasn't going to be ruler anymore. Gregory says on top of that this is because the only universal power on earth was the power of the papacy. As an aside, by the way, in this 1,000 years that we've covered, look how far we've come from the Bishop of Rome being the bishop over the city of Rome to the Bishop of Rome being the only universal power on earth in just these 1,000 years. And obviously this does not go over well with the rulers of Europe, especially with the Holy Roman Emperor, who was at the time Henry IV. Henry, in response to this, states that Gregory no longer has his support as Pope. And he calls for the election of a new Pope. He also, to further defy this claim of the power of the papacy, appoints his own personal chaplain as Bishop of Milan, even after the church there had already selected a candidate to fill that role. And in response to this, starts a string of crazy things. Gregory excommunicates Henry. He declares he's no longer the Holy Roman Emperor, and he releases all Christians under his authority, all Christians in the realms of the Holy Roman Empire, from any allegiance to King Henry. And this is just the start of wave after wave of conflict over this investiture controversy. You have the church fighting the rulers of Europe really for some time to come over this. But even as all of this is happening, you also see beginning a movement towards European Christians improving what they would call their own personal piety, their own holiness. And this is top down. You see this with ordinary people and with kings alike. There was an increasingly articulate piety, especially within the knighthood all across Europe. And the developing practices of the nobility, whether it be devotional or penitential, create a fertile ground for what later becomes the crusading ideal. And part of what comes with this is a heightened interest in going on pilgrimage, going to a place that was said to be particularly holy for whatever reason, so that you could partake in that holiness and become a better follower of God, at least in their minds. And for obvious reasons, the pinnacle of Christian pilgrimage throughout the last 2,000 years has been the Holy Land, where Christ lived and died. So you begin to see people from all strata of society embarking on trips across the holy sites of Europe and the East. Pilgrimage to the Holy Land expanded and started to grow really after several safe routes were paved through Eastern Europe around 1000 or so. Rome becomes a popular destination. This is a medieval map of Rome. For obvious reasons, this is where the Pope, the Holy Father, resided. Places like Santiago de Compostela in northwestern Spain, which supposedly holds relics from the body of James, and others like these grew in popularity as well. And after the Holy Land falls to the Muslims in the 7th century, it became increasingly difficult for Christians to go on pilgrimage there, as you could expect. Political relationships between the Muslim caliphates and the Christian kingdoms of Europe stay in this kind of suspended truce, to put it that way, which does allow for the continuation of Christians going on pilgrimage into these Muslim-controlled lands, at least in spurts of time. For one example, under the Fatimid Caliphate, one caliph orders the destruction of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, only to have the guy who comes after him allow the Byzantines to rebuild it. But aside from these, many other Muslim groups, such as the Seljuk Turks, were not as peaceful, and they actively harassed and attacked groups of pilgrims that were traveling to the Holy Land. We don't know the full extent of that, but we would see that the existence of this fact would come to be used to stoke up the crusading ideal. But even as this is happening to Christians in the Muslim world as a whole is fractured at the start of the Crusades, because there's divisions over leadership in the primary caliphates in charge of the region, essentially, largely caused by the fact that the rulers of two different caliphates die basically at the same time. And there's kind of fights over who's going to replace them. And so when the first Crusaders came to the Holy Land to try to reclaim Jerusalem, the Muslims were not ready at all. They were not prepared, and they were taken totally by surprise. All that to say, there's many, many possible motives for the Crusades. Some people certainly probably had a spiritual motivation, desire through penance, through warfare, I guess you could put it. Some may have had a political motivation, perhaps being younger, landless sons of noblemen looking to go and gain prestige or fame or wealth. Some people may, and certainly did in some cases, have a purely economic motivation, seeking to either profit off of what was existing in place in the Holy Land or plunder the riches of the Holy Land. It's been suggested by some that some people who went had no motivation for going, but they were basically forced to go because they were in service to these feudal lords in Europe who did go. Whatever the case may be, there were a great many people with a great deal of different motives to go crusading to the Holy Land. And all that came to its genesis in 1095, when the Pope at the time, Pope Urban II, who, as I just mentioned, cited Muslim persecution of Christian pilgrims, decided at the Council of Clermont to make a call to arms to all European Christians to march on the Holy Land and to retake the holy city of Jerusalem, saying that, quote, a barbaric fury had deplorably afflicted and laid waste the churches of God in the regions of the Orient. And he called for the European princes to free the churches of the East, as he put it. Now, he doesn't use the word crusade during the time of the Crusades. The word crusade doesn't exist at this time. They use words like journey or pilgrimage to describe these inevitably military expeditions. It's not until the end of the 1100s that we see a term come about for these crusading Christians, and that is crucis signatus in Latin, meaning one signed by the cross. And the way this goes into French, or Old French at the time, leads to it gradually being shortened to the word croisade, meaning the way of the cross, and that's the root of what becomes later the English word crusade. But an amazing thing happens when Urban calls for this quest against the Muslims. Thousands, tens of thousands of people feel the stirrings of the crusading ideal and leave their lives behind and head out for Jerusalem. Now, for perspective, we need to understand something about this time. These tens of thousands of people, and by some accounts hundreds of thousands of people, had not done anything like this really in Christian history. This is a significant, a radical break from anything that has happened in Christian history up to this point. Up to this point, Christians had gone to war, but Christians had gone to war in support of the state, usually to pursue some political objective. They may have felt that their state was a Christian state, and that in going to war for the state, they were doing something that was good in the eyes of God. They had in fact believed that part of the separation of church and state was that the state was given power by God to protect the nation and to promote peace. Whereas on the other side, the church had a spiritual mission to carry out on earth. But with the coming of this crusading ideal, or these multiple crusading ideals in Europe, this idea begins to change. And Christians begin to believe that it is legitimate to use force, not in the interest of the state, but in the interest of the church, to advance the church and the cause of Christ, and not just defend the state. Christians had gone to war for the state. They had never gone to war specifically for the church. And that's really the key to all of this. I mean, like I said, there's many possible causes of the crusade, spiritual or not. But at its deepest meaning, the shift from seeing conflict as within the hands of the different realms of Europe, the different states of Europe, to seeing conflict as something that you could in fact do out of devotion to God is, at least to me, the final piece of the puzzle that brings all of these loose ends together, that goes on to inspire so many people to leave Europe and head into certain danger, and for tens of thousands of them, certain death. We will go ahead and take a break here. On the other side, we will talk about how the Crusades truly begin from here. Now, as we see Pope Urban's call to arms spread across Europe, what people had been thinking for a long time in Europe suddenly rockets to the forefront of their conscience. The infidel holds Jerusalem. Now, the infidel had held Jerusalem for a long time now, centuries. So why all of a sudden was this so traumatic? Because now the infidel is disrupting our ability to walk in the steps of our Lord in the Holy Land. And now this is finally a problem that we're going to take action about. We want it back, and we're going to go take it back. The first people that we see responding to the call are actually poor people. Mobs of poor people, thousands of whom were led by a man named Peter the Hermit, who they almost immediately left after the word from Pope Urban got around. And you can break down their journey pretty simply. There were several what were called popular crusades that were mostly just civilians going to try to go to Jerusalem. But this journey is in pretty simple parts. They march across Germany, where along the way they massacre thousands of Jews. They make it all the way to the borders, the eastern borders of the Byzantine Empire in Anatolia, so now Turkey, where they are ambushed and entirely annihilated by a Turkish army. Pretty straightforward. As this is happening, what's known as the Prince's Crusade launches, which is what we think of as the First Crusade. The People's Crusade was the first true crusade. This now, the Prince's Crusade, is what is popularly the First Crusade. Between fighting men, knights, and civilians, about 100,000 people from all over Europe head for Jerusalem, and they are led by various members of European nobility, names like Raymond of Toulouse, Adhemar of Le Puy from southern France, Godfrey of Bouillon, Baldwin of Boulogne from northern France, Normans, who we think of in England, actually from Italy, like Bohemond of Taranto, and many others. They head out in summer of 1096, and gradually, over time, they arrive in Constantinople between about November and April of 1097. From there, they march across Anatolia, southward, suffering all the way from starvation, dehydration, desertion, before they win just by the narrowest margin at the Muslim-held city of Dorylaeum, further south in Anatolia. From there, one of our names, Baldwin of Boulogne, takes his own force. He marches for the city of Antioch, which is now in Turkey, but at the time was part of Syria. And he captures it in June of 1098, and from there, he goes on to establish what's called the County of Edessa, which is the first Crusader state, which we'll talk about the Crusader states in a second. The rest of the forces make it to Jerusalem by June of 1099, and from there, they fully besiege the city. When they finally made it inside the walls, they proceeded to indiscriminately slaughter everyone they could find, whether that was Muslims, Jews, even Eastern Christians. They didn't stop to ask people who they were. They just killed who they saw. And as a side note, if you've ever heard Muslims or anyone else use the Crusades as an accusation against Christianity, this is what they're thinking of. The slaughter of the inhabitants of Jerusalem at the end of the First Crusade. So after they beat back a brief counterattack by the Muslims, the Crusaders are victorious against all the odds. They traveled thousands of miles. They've suffered immense hardship. Hundreds, if not thousands, have died in battle. But they reclaimed the holy city. And from Jerusalem, those that remained, because many left and went home, those that remained and settled there spread out and established other Crusader states as they are known historically. There came to be 4 in total, and you can see it from north to south. The County of Edessa, the Principality of Antioch, the County of Tripoli, and the Kingdom of Jerusalem, each of them being named after the capital city of each of the states. In the grand scheme of time, none of them lasted particularly long. The County of Edessa was the first to fall in 1150, just 53 years after it began. And the kingdom of Jerusalem was the last to fall, holding out until 1291, when the last Crusaders fled the Holy Land entirely. But the ones who settled there, the Europeans that settled there, were anything but unproductive, just taking it and just sitting on it. They almost immediately seized on all of the existing trade networks and resources that were available, and they made all of the nobles and all of the church that ended up going there extremely wealthy, while leaving basically everyone else, especially those who were native to the land, in poverty, and often bound in service to feudal lords. Those that came to power in the Crusader states were predominantly Franks, if you can remember them, from across France. Few, if any, people that were native to the Holy Land had any sort of power whatsoever. After they had settled in, the Crusaders began to refortify, or in some cases just add more fortifications that were to what was already there, to the cities that they had taken over. And they also built what perhaps they're most famous for, at least architecturally speaking, castles. Here are a few examples of them. This is the Croix de Chevalier in western Syria, which is the largest Crusader castle still standing. These are the ruins of Beaufort Castle, which is in southern Lebanon. And this is the Kerak Castle at Al-Kerak in Jordan. From these castles and more, Crusader forces on the whole kept the peace as best they could in the Holy Land. And yet, despite Crusader rule, their Muslim neighbors eventually regrouped, and they began a long campaign of almost constant attacks against all of the Crusader states. This goes on to touch off the Second Crusade, which was actually the first to be led by kings themselves of Europe, in response to the fall of the county Edessa in 1150. This was a failure entirely, and it contributed to the eventual surrender of Jerusalem to the Muslim forces of Saladin in 1187, which went on to spark the Third Crusade. And if you have ever seen the movie Kingdom of Heaven, the one with Orlando Bloom, it is loosely based around this event, the battle for and then the surrender of Jerusalem, and then that leading to what we normally think of when we think of the Crusades, which is the Third Crusade. So in 1189, 2 years after this, the kings of England and France and the Holy Roman Emperor at the time led armies from their homeland on a mission to recapture Jerusalem. It's from this period where we get such figures as Richard the Lionheart, Richard I, the legendary English king, Saladin, perhaps the most notable figure Islam has ever produced, not named Muhammad. And, if you recall it actually, Robin Hood. It's in this time, believe it or not, where the legend of Robin Hood taking on the rich to give to the poor and fighting the Sheriff of Nottingham and the wicked Prince John comes into being during this time when King Richard is in the Holy Land. And though the Crusaders did enjoy some success, they won some battles, they retook some cities, and they held those cities. In the goal of recapturing Jerusalem, the Third Crusade was a failure. In its primary goal, the Third Crusade failed. Richard actually ends up failing to march on Jerusalem. He decides not to. By this point, the Holy Roman Emperor has died on the way to Jerusalem. The King of France has left, so it's just him. And he decides not to march on Jerusalem. Instead, he negotiates a truce with Saladin, where the Muslims would hold the city in exchange for allowing unarmed Christians to come in and trade and go on pilgrimage to Jerusalem. This decision by Richard would go on to lead to the declaration of the Fourth Crusade 6 years later, which I want to highlight, but I'll come back to it in a bit. Around the time of the Fourth Crusade, we see Pope Innocent III, and you'll hear that name a lot from here to the end, institute a policy which became famous in his day, but is now incredibly infamous in our time. He declared that all who went on crusade or supported the Crusaders could expect to receive remission of sins and a reduction of time or an absence of time entirely in purgatory as a reward for their service to the Crusades. This was partly out of a misguided attempt to appeal to what was at the time popular piety, and partly out of an unspoken need voiced by the European nobility behind the scenes to try to find ways to get people to settle in the Crusader states and try to stem the bleeding that the Muslim armies were constantly inflicting there. But aside from the obvious promises that made it tempting, at least, this worked out because at this time, and then further on still, Innocent was probably the most influential pope of the Middle Ages. At one point, he had authority over basically every ruler in Europe, largely because most of them were away fighting in the East, so those at home weren't going to say anything. And pretty much all of them, home or abroad, had such a desire to crusade or to support the Crusades that they just accepted his authority on the grounds of the papacy sanctioning the Crusades. There would be 5 more Crusades launched against Muslims in the East, those being the 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, and 9th Crusades. Many not actually even directly involving the Holy Land, many with the plan to retake the Holy Land when we had defeated the Ayyubid dynasty, which was in Egypt and controlled the Holy Land from Egypt. And while the Crusaders did briefly retake Jerusalem during the 6th Crusade, they lost it again pretty quickly thereafter. And so from its highest heights at the capture of Jerusalem in 1099, that Crusader presence steadily declines and wanes for the next almost 100 years, until in 1291, the last Crusaders in the East flee to the Kingdom of Cyprus, leaving permanently no remaining Crusader presence in the Holy Land. I mentioned that there were other Crusades as well happening in Europe at the time, and these went on actually for much longer than the Crusades in the East did. There was the Reconquista in Spain, which started out as an attempt to win back Spain from Muslim rule and ended up in what we know today as the Spanish Inquisition, burning anyone we accused of heresy whenever we saw fit. A full-on campaign to root out the heretics and the schismatics. There was the Albigensian Crusade, launched against the Cathar cult in southern France with the aim of wiping them out. And although I don't agree with the violence against them, the Cathars did technically believe there were 2 gods. One being the evil god of the Old Testament, and the one being the good God, whose power was limited by the evil god. So I can at least understand theologically wanting to get rid of that idea. There were political crusades launched by a string of popes who really just wanted to get rid of their political enemies, mainly in Italy and in the Holy Roman Empire. And there were the Northern Crusades in what's now the Baltic states and Poland and northern Germany, which were aimed at eliminating basically all the remaining pagans in the area, which there weren't a lot of, but there were still some. So there was a lot of crusading going on all over the place, be it for religious zeal or politics or both, often both. As I said, though, I want to single out the 4th Crusade, just briefly, because I'm of the opinion that it's probably the worst of the Crusades, and perhaps the biggest example of just how off course the crusading ideals took people. The 4th Crusade was called by Pope Innocent in 1202, out of a desire to retake Jerusalem since the Third Crusade had failed to do so. So a force of some 35,000 soldiers and knights heads out from all over, prepared to actually travel across the sea to reach the Holy Land. This crusade was almost entirely doomed, basically from the outset. First, there was never any agreement on where they should set sail from. There was never one place they decided to meet at and then leave from. Some of them said Flanders, some of them said Marseille, some of them said Genoa. But by the time those who hadn't already picked those places and left reached Venice, there were only about 12,000 of them, and they had almost run out of money. This was a problem because before arriving in Venice, they had struck a deal with the Venetians, who at this time were generally considered the just cream of the crop, best shipbuilders in all of Europe. And the deal was to obtain roughly 500 transports and warships, enough to hold the entire original 35,000 strong army. Problem is, Crusaders have almost no money. They offer a portion of what the original agreed upon price was, but the Venetians refused this immediately. And they decided they would not let the Crusaders leave Venice until they had been paid in full. And in context, it made sense. While it would leave the Crusaders more than penniless to just take all their money, the Venetians had shut down almost their entire economy to fill this order for the ships. So if they didn't get paid, the entire city was in trouble. So the Venetians and the Crusaders agree to a proposal. The Crusaders could obtain the money by going and intimidating or attacking various cities that have somewhere between neutral and negative relations with Venice along the shores of the Adriatic Sea. These attacks culminate in the siege of Zara, a city which was in debt to the Venetians, which was filled with Christians, and whose king himself had actually vowed to join the crusade. Before the siege began, Pope Innocent heard that this was going to happen, and he sent an initial letter to the leaders of the army and said clearly that if they attacked or harmed any fellow Christians, everyone in the army would be excommunicated. Whether the letter didn't get there in time or not, we don't really know, but the attack proceeded, and the Crusaders and the Venetians laid waste to Zara. And so when Innocent hears of this, he sends them another letter making good on his promise. He proclaims that they are excommunicated. And this time, the leaders of the army actively withheld the information from the rest of the army, and they chose to march to Jerusalem. Innocent would later go on to rescind this the next year because he believed that the Crusaders had been coerced by the Venetians, but the power of the threat of excommunication still remained. So after this happens, the Crusaders were persuaded by the Venetians to head for Constantinople, not Jerusalem, Constantinople first. Venice and Constantinople had been rivals in naval trade, especially, for centuries. And the leader of Venice himself, the Doge of Venice himself, had been blinded during a conflict with the Byzantines, actually. And so he just poured fuel on that fire. At the time, the most recent emperor, who was Isaac II of Constantinople, had been deposed and had been replaced by his brother, Alexios III. Another brother who did not like this Alexios, who was also named Alexios IV, wanted the throne for himself. So he approaches the Crusader army with a proposal, and it was an enormous proposal. He offered to pay the entire debt owed to the Venetians, give 200,000 silver marks to the Crusaders, give them 10,000 professional Byzantine troops for the crusade, pay for the maintenance of 500 knights in the Holy Land, offer the service of the Byzantine navy to transport the Crusaders to Egypt, and on top of all these things, offers the placement of the entire Eastern Orthodox Church under the authority of the Pope. All they have to do is sail to Constantinople and depose Alexios III. As you would expect, much of this wasn't actually his to give, especially the authority of the Eastern Church itself. But that was the promise. And so, desperate for money, the Crusaders struck the deal, and they marched to Constantinople. If you recall from the times that we've talked about it throughout our study, for much of its history, Constantinople was the largest and the wealthiest city in all of Europe, all of Christendom. And it was still this way at this time. And it was still this way when the Crusaders arrived. But by August of 1203, this was not the case anymore. The Crusaders won against the Byzantines, and they sacked Constantinople. They placed Alexios IV on the throne. And for a while, everything settled down and actually seemed okay. Alexios starts making payments to the Crusaders. They maintain a camp not far from the city, so they actually, while they're getting paid, they also, at least at times, help to, or at least offer to provide for the defense of the city, or help with the defense of the city. But by January of 1204, all these good times came to an end. Alexios IV himself was deposed in a popular uprising in the city, which meant, obviously, that the Crusaders were not getting paid anymore. And so their solution was to sack the city again. And what follows this decision to sack the city rivals the slaughter at Jerusalem during the First Crusade in terms of just sheer brutality and savagery. For 3 days after they defeated the Byzantine, the Crusaders and the Venetians ran entirely unchecked through the city. Nothing and no one was safe or sacred. Everything that could be considered valuable, they went after. Countless ancient and medieval Roman and Greek works were either stolen or destroyed. Works of immeasurable artistic value were often just destroyed because of the value that the Byzantines placed in them. The Crusaders systematically violated all of the holy sites in the city, all churches, all sanctuaries, everything, destroying and stealing everything they could lay their hands on. Nothing was spared. Not even the tombs of the Eastern emperors inside the St. Apostles' Church were spared. At least tens of thousands of civilians were murdered. By some counts, not a lot, but by a couple of sources, almost half the city of 500,000 people was killed by the Crusaders. Thousands of women, including nuns, were taken and raped by the Crusader army, which sacked all of the hundreds of churches, all of the monasteries, all of the convents. The altars of the churches themselves were smashed and torn to pieces to get at the gold and the marble that was in them. And I want to read a quote from a historian of this time who really encapsulates what happened in Constantinople. Some of it repeats what I've said, but the imagery is just horrifying. He says, "The Latin soldiery subjected the greatest city in Europe to an indescribable sack. For 3 days they murdered, raped, looted, and destroyed on a scale which even the ancient Vandals and Goths would have found unbelievable. Constantinople had become a veritable museum of ancient and Byzantine art, an emporium of such incredible wealth that the Latins were astounded at the riches they found. Though the Venetians had an appreciation for the art which they discovered, they were themselves semi-Byzantines, and saved much of it. The French and others destroyed indiscriminately, halting to refresh themselves with wine, violation of nuns, and murder of Orthodox clerics. The Crusaders vented their hatred for the Greeks most spectacularly in the desecration of the greatest church in Christendom. They smashed the silver iconostasis, the icons, and the holy books of Hagia Sophia, and they seated on the patriarchal throne a whore who sang coarse songs as they drank wine from the church's holy vessels. The estrangement of East and West, which had proceeded over the centuries, culminated in the horrible massacre that accompanied the conquest of Constantinople. The Greeks were convinced that even the Turks, had they taken the city, would not have been as cruel as the Latin Christians. The defeat of Byzantium, already in a state of decline, accelerated political degeneration so that the Byzantines eventually became an easy prey to the Turks. The Fourth Crusade and the crusading movement generally thus resulted ultimately in the victory of Islam, a result which was, of course, the exact opposite of its original intention. So while the Crusaders are doing what they please during this 3-day indiscriminate spree, the Venetians restrained themselves from violence, and they set to work like seasoned professional thieves, scooping up the best of what remained of the city's treasures. And everything that they could get their hands on, they brought back to Venice. I want to show you some examples of the best of that are still in Venice today. These are the columns of St. Mark and St. Theodore. The one on what would be the left has the Lion of St. Mark. The one on the right has the figure of St. Theodore. Both of them were stolen from Constantinople. These are the columns, or the pillars, the dozens of marble pillars, some of them in this picture anyway, that adorn the front of St. Mark's Basilica. Every one of them, dozens of them, every one of them was stolen from churches in Constantinople. But these are the most notable example. These are the famous horses of St. Mark. These were made during the reign of Marcus Aurelius, which was the early 2nd century. They were brought by Constantine to Byzantium before it had been renamed to Constantinople. These were originally mounted in Constantinople at the Hippodrome, which was the famous horse racing track. If you see the collars on the horses, these were later additions welded on or grafted on by the Venetians to cover for the fact that as they tried to smuggle them out of the city, they chopped the heads off of each horse to make them easier to ship back to Venice. You'll obviously find throughout history that is true of any nation that has ever collected the spoils of war from a defeated foe. But you will find it particularly true that a vast quantity of the art and architecture that is most famously found in Venice today was originally stolen from somewhere else, most often Constantinople, especially after the Fourth Crusade. When they had finished destroying the city, the Crusaders and the Venetians split the spoils, and they divided up the lands of the Byzantine Empire. The lands of the Crusaders became the Latin Empire. This is actually today why there's still both a Latin and a Greek patriarch in what's now Istanbul. And although the Greeks would go on to reclaim the Byzantine throne after about 50 years or so, the Byzantine Empire was never the same. It never recovered, and it continued to diminish until the Ottomans took the city in 1453. So why do I say this is the worst crusade to me? Because unlike all of the other crusades, as I said, there were 4 things called crusades. Out of all of the other crusades, even though the stated purpose of this one was to retake Jerusalem, and some of the crusaders from this did go on to make it to Jerusalem, this crusade was pretty much built on a foundation of slaughtering fellow Christians. Fellow Christians, not going to Jerusalem and reclaiming from the infidel the holy city, slaughtering fellow Christians. The Crusaders needed money to pay Venice, so they attacked a Christian city. They wanted more money, so they sacked the largest Christian city to put their financier, essentially, on the throne. They stopped getting money, so they then sack again the greatest city in all of Christendom and practically destroyed it to get what they were owed. More than any of the others that I have looked through, this crusade in practice was built entirely on greed and the promise of material gain. There was much more we could have looked at in this overview, but I think it would have taken at least 3 times longer, and this was a good sample size, I would say. If nothing else, what I want you to take away from this is that the Crusades, like basically all of history, are not something you can nicely simplify and pencil in the good guys and the bad guys. These were messy, bloody, slaughtering times where the church, to cement its own power, begins to use God to justify slaughter. This is not, as we see in the Old Testament, God commanding the Israelites to wipe out the peoples of Canaan. This is not like that. This is man telling himself that the name of the Lord can be stamped onto anything we want done, and the people will do it. And the people did do it. There were atrocities by both Christians and Muslims, so we can't declare either of them to be the good guy. But Islam did come out on top in this existential battle throughout the course of the Crusades over the region of the Holy Land, and really over the entire region of the Middle East, which you can still see today. So from these times, the church as we have known it building to this point really begins to become the Catholic Church, the church that we think of in the time of the Reformation, that is inseparably intermingled with the state at the time, to the extent where it uses the state to carry out its own justice. And it starts to look less like the church, even less than it has already seemed. It starts to look much less like the church, and more like what the papacy wants it to look like. Next week, we will go back to England and France and take a look at their centuries-long struggle for power, which culminates in the 100 Years' War. We'll talk about why that's a misleading term a little bit, as well as the coming of the Black Plague and how it ravaged and, if God had decided on it, nearly destroyed all of Europe. But until then, have a good night.